Mirë se erdhën Public Square, unë jam Ditmir Bushati. Si mund të bësh diferencën dhe ndryshimin në politikat publike përmes pjesëmarrjes, përmes atij që quhet lobimi mirë? Si mund mbledhësh së bashku një grup njerëzish të cilët kanë vullnetin për të ndryshuar politikbërjen, por edhe ekspertizën në nivel kombëtar apo edhe në nivel pan-europian? Kam ftuar sot Alberto Alemannin, profesor në shkollën prestigjioze të biznesit në Paris, ekspert i së drejtës dhe gjithashtu themelues i Good Lobby Initiative. Dear Alberto, welcome to Public Square. I would like to start our discussion by asking you a question in relation to the elections for the European Parliament, as we are few weeks ahead of these elections. What is your main assessment about the elections and the expectations we should have from those elections?
European elections have historically been a second-order election. That basically means that they are not the most important elections in the minds of the citizens. So they don't necessarily translate their immediate preferences. We have a very limited turnout, approximately 45–50% in average since 1976, the first time European citizens had the chance to vote. And those elections in 2024 will be particularly important because we'll define the political priorities for the next European Commission, which is de facto the executive of the European Union. And they seem to be changing from a focus on the Green New Deal to an agenda that will be, rather than green, will be more brown: industrial policy in defense, transformation of the entire industrial priorities of Europe. So there's a lot of expectations, and since European elections are nothing else but 27 parallel elections, because each country defines how to select his own representative in Strasbourg, well, it won't be easy to actually second-guess the outcome of those elections. And we expect clearly a major shift of the pendulum from the center-left, which is the current center of gravity of the European Parliament, towards a more center-right, a more conservative European Parliament dominated by some political parties, political groups, such as the Conservatives led by Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, Mr. Morawiecki in Poland, but also Identity and Democracy, people like Marine Le Pen or the AfD in Germany, that will initially, probably for the first time, calling the shots, having a weight in that parliament. To make a long story short, we can expect a much more fragmented European Parliament in which the historically mainstream parties, meaning the Popular Party, the Socialists, and the Liberals, won't necessarily be able to define a permanent parliamentary majority supporting the next Commission. So a lot of uncertainty ahead of those elections.
If I have to borrow from your analysis the words lots of uncertainties, shifting from green policy to a brown policy or brown agenda, and having 27 parallel elections and parallel, I would say, or I would add also concerns in different capitals or in different countries of Europe, how this will impact also the formation of the new institutions. So basically the European Commission, the President of the Council, the High Rep. So what's your analysis?
Well, as time goes by, the ability of the European Union to translate the electoral outcome into new institutions, new political leadership, has become more difficult. Only 15 years ago, it was quite immediate to identify who might have been leading the Commission, the Parliament presidency, the top job of the ECB. But now everything is more complicated. And we already saw this in 2019 when it took several weeks for European leaders to actually select the president of the European Commission. We might expect in 2024 that it might take even more time to find such a political compromise in order to somehow Europeanize this political process and to make it easier. In 2009, the Lisbon Treaty, the last time we changed the rules of the game, it was determined that each European political party should actually designate a head of the list, a Spitzenkandidaten, to use the German term that comes from that electoral system. The idea was very simple. The idea was to show to the average voter that his or her vote will be linked to the political color of the next government of Europe. However, as we all know, this system only worked well once in 2014, when the lead candidate for the party, the European Popular Party that got most of the vote, Mr. Juncker, became president of the Commission. In 2019, it didn't happen the same. None of the Spitzenkandidaten, none of the candidates put forward by the European political parties was actually selected. Mr. Weber, who was in principle the winner on paper, was set aside by the head of state and government, gathering within the European Council, who have rather been cherry-picking the then Minister of Defense, Ms. von der Leyen, who became suddenly, without running for the European Parliament, without having a political program ready, the next President of the European Commission. And ahead of 2024, there's a lack of clarity also on the rules of the game, because if each European political party has been selecting a candidate, a lead candidate, from the Greens all the way to the right and the far right, well, not even Madame von der Leyen, who is apparently the favorite candidate for the post, has any certainty at all that she will eventually be selected by the head of state and government. So all of this lack of intelligibility of the system renders the transformation of the votes of the citizens into a political majority a much more difficult exercise than in the average member state of the Union or in any other country of the world.
Will the rise of conservative wing represented by Giorgia Meloni and other leaders that you have mentioned influence the direction that the next Commission will move, especially in topics related to migration, but also industrial policy, defense?
I would say that the conservatives, and partly also identity and democracy, so far-right party ranging from Vox all the way to AfD or Marine Le Pen, or Wilders in the Netherlands, they have already shaped the political agenda of the right. If you look at the policy on migration that the European Union has been putting forward and recently agreed upon, are basically policies that the far right has been advocating for over a decade. This idea of securitizing the borders, of externalizing the security of Europe by giving funding to neighboring countries, be it Turkey, be Libya, be Tunisia, it's really an approach that comes from that policy. So on one hand, the right and far right have already shaped the political agenda as we know it. And as a result of the next European elections, this will become even more mainstream. And this is due to the fact that mainstream parties won't necessarily be able to have a solid majority. Therefore, they will need to rely more and more on these groups that are set to get bigger. We can think about dozens and dozens of new MEPs. We expect a major increase of candidates coming from Germany, AfD, from France, Marine Le Pen, but also Vox in Spain, and of course, Giorgia Meloni, Brothers of Italy, that alone might become the third largest group in the party, meaning after the EPP and after the S&D. For the first time, we're going to have a right-wing group that will be somehow defining the priority as Europe. So it would be very difficult for the new president of the Commission, regardless of whether it will be Madame von der Leyen or anybody else, not to listen to this emerging new group of the parliament that will certainly be extremely conservative on social issues, extremely conservative on decarbonization, and will certainly impose to push the pause button on climate action, and potentially also render Europe more insulated and also more conservative when it comes to the enlargement policy. So this idea of consolidating the European project through enlargement might also become somehow more difficult should the right and the far right get more of a control of the next European Parliament.
How much the electoral mood in US will shape European Parliament elections? What's your take on that? Because we see, let's say, a network of leaders. Some of them have been mentioned also by you that do have good contacts with Donald Trump. And there are other leaders that are closer to Joe Biden. Do you think that this will influence also the outcome of elections for the European Parliament, especially in key EU member states?
My take is that the US election in 2024 will probably be one of the most defining moments of our political life as citizens, and will probably affect the Union more than the results of the European elections. So paradoxically, American voters have more to say and to shape Europe than the citizens of Europe. And this for a variety of reasons, but mainly because there is already a dividing line within Europe between those leaders who are sympathizers of a Trump administration. Clearly, this is epitomized by Viktor Orban, who has never stopped having a privileged relationship with that conservative right of the United States, but also leaders who have been playing a different kind of role in siding, for instance, in support of Ukraine, like Giorgia Meloni in Italy, but in reality, looking at a possible US administration as a liberation, because certainly a Trump administration would lead to closing the Russian invasion of Ukraine, pushing the Ukrainian authority to accept a pact. And there are at least 3 or 4 member states of the Union who are sympathetic to this. So the real dividing line today in Europe is not necessarily between the right or the left, the north or the south, but between those countries that are pushing for more autonomy, sovereign autonomy of Europe, and those who actually never believed into that and continue to create dependence on foreign countries, be it the United States or Russia.
In the past, you have written a lot about EU and how to make EU a people's project. And I would like to have your view in the context of enlargement and in the context of reforms. I know in the past you have contributed also in this conference for the future of Europe, where you came up also with some ideas. If I have to share with you one of my concerns is in relation to the missing citizen aspect also in the enlargement table. So what are your reflections in this respect?
When you look at the European integration project as it started off after the Second World War, and you fast forward till 2024, you will see that historically the role of citizens has been neglected. Citizens never really had a role to play in such an incredible story. The European integration occurred because of a political elite of head of state and government supported by their administrations that basically decided that coming together after the Second World War could have been the best possible recipes against war and potentially to create growth. Well, that vision partly realized despite a few bumps, notably in some regions in the neighboring Europe, as the Balkans and the former Yugoslavia witnessed as a result of the wars of the 80s and 90s, we can see that project needs somehow to finally look into the citizens' eyes in order to acquire the legitimacy needed to survive and to be perpetuated. And this is something that European leaders every while and then seem to remember. So only 5 years ago, when Madame von der Leyen got elected by the European Parliament, she immediately said that we had to finally listen to the European citizens and get their ear in order to be able to move along. Unfortunately, 5 years have passed by and very little has occurred. We are ahead of European elections that haven't necessarily been felt by the average citizens. And more critically, we don't see any effort of the European Union to open up to the voices that exist of millions of citizens in candidate countries, in countries that have been queuing for many, many years, in which the public opinion has historically been positive or very positive or a bit more tepid, depending on the current conversation and relationship between Europe and that government. But overall, we have normalized the fact that citizens, neither into the European Union nor those waiting outside of the Union, have a voice into that process. And normalizing that, I think, is a dangerous game at a time of democratic erosion, at a time in which the youth is less and less a believer in the quality of democracy vis-à-vis autocracy in tackling the major geopolitical challenges and transformation of the planet ahead of us. And that's why over time I've been trying to develop an entire research agenda that I also try to publicize and beautify in the media, which aims at arguing that today it is actually possible to build a Europe that belongs to people and to citizens. And why do I argue that? I argue that because after years and years in research, I realized that the European Union as we know it offers both to citizens and residents of Europe, but potentially also citizens who live in candidate countries, to actually engage with the European institutions through petitions, complaints, letters, in a way that is much more significant than the situation existing in the average member state of the Union. And this is very powerful because you can see that in the past, on many occasions, citizens were able to push for a particular policy. The due diligence directive that has recently been adopted by the parliament is something that doesn't come from the politicians. It comes from civil society organizations who wanted to make businesses more responsible along the supply chain. Is a major transformation. Similarly, whistleblowing protection, the fact that whistleblowers, those who basically report wrongdoing coming from companies or politicians or decision makers, should be protected and should be used as an instrument of anti-corruption, is also an idea that was not in the European political parties' manifestos, but came up from the bottom up. And there are so many examples showing how in Europe agenda setting can be done by the citizens when they somehow take the liberty and the bravery to raise their voice and trying to get heard. I know that it sounds very counterintuitive. We perceive the European Union as very far away, as made of big institutions that are not very human. But I can tell you that it is possible in Europe more than anywhere else to actually get channels of participation that might potentially allow citizens, group of citizens, to set the agenda ahead of us. So what if more citizens would use of those opportunities, how Europe would look like? We lack the counterfactual, but I'm very hopeful that Europe will be inhabited by citizens who will give it a chance and will basically complement representative democracy in such a way.
This is something which is unfortunately missing also in the enlargement process, and we are suffering also from the lack of ownership when it comes to the reform process. And in this context, let me ask you something also about the principle or the notion that you have pushed forward, the good lobby. You are a founder of a good lobby. And how this can help countries in the accession process, or countries like Albania or Western Balkan countries, in order to strengthen civil society, but also to connect various dots of the expertise in the society in order to push for a positive agenda, for a reformist agenda in the society. Because we are witnessing an apathy where people basically go and vote every 4 years, and there are a few who are running for office. But there are no layers in between these two levels. So what can be done? What is your experience telling in this respect?
There's no doubt that the democratic system as we know it today is lacking responsiveness and enough support, notably in the space in between elections. In other words, it's no longer enough for a politician to get elected because the space existing between an electoral moment and another is long. And the knowledge that used to be a monopoly of those representing us, we were paying them to do that, is spread, is diffused. So everybody has a claim to potentially contribute to decision making. This is a very interesting space to inquire in order to explore and somehow push for what we often call political innovations. And one of the political innovations I've been contributing to theorize and to practice and foster in Europe has been this idea that in the same way in which special interest groups, companies do engage with policymakers in the space existing between one election and another, by reminding them that they need to listen, to gather data and evidence and trying to figuring out what kind of impact their decisions might be having on society, on the economy, on the environment, well, also citizens should be entitled to do the same. And that's in reality is something obvious, but we don't do it. We often perceive the term lobbying as something dirty, as something that is carrying a negative connotation. But if you think about it, lobbying is nothing else but participation. It's about somebody who tries to influence decision makers by pushing a particular agenda. By arguing in favor of a particular group, of a particular interest. And democracy thrives if we have many more interests that are represented, and politicians need citizens in order to take the best possible decisions. So over time, I've been arguing that what we need to do now is to demystify and democratize lobbying as a legitimate form of participation by creating an entire opportunity infrastructure that allow the average citizen to actually push for his causes, for his interest, in order to get the ear of the policymakers. Of course, it's going to be confusing. Of course, it will be more challenging for policymakers to engage with all these different interests. But we can all assume that if the policymakers are exposed to all possible interests in society and will be taking those into account, well, the policy outcomes will certainly be more own, more legitimate, more accepted, and potentially they're going to create much more welfare than if they only listen to some sides, to a few people, to a few special interests, as opposed to the many. So in a nutshell, I've been arguing over time that the future of democracy lies not only in representative democracy, which is there to stay. We need to keep voting, electing, and showing up much more. We need more people running for office, but we also not let them alone. We need to keep them company as citizens, because of course democracy is much more than elections, and this participation is also needed for policymakers to do a better job. So there's a full complementarity between representative democracy and participatory democracy. And there are so many tools, including citizen lobbying, but also deliberative democracy, like citizens assembly, randomly selected citizens and asking them what they think. How would you advise? Participatory budgeting, allocating a budget on a city based on citizens' preferences. Should we create more sidewalks? Should we have a path for the bike? Should we have yet another playground? Those decisions should be also left and shared with citizens. So more power sharing as a possible recipe to create more resilience in our democratic system.
But can you share with us, Alberto, a few success stories in this respect?
Yes, I can tell you my personal story. As a citizen of Europe, who has been living across European countries. I got a scholarship. I come from a quite modest background. I come from a very industrial city called Torino. That's where I grew up. I realized quite early, I think it was in 2008, 2010, that it was possible to mobilize people, notably through the internet, and to identify like-minded individuals asking for the same. And at the time, for people like me who had the chance to cross the borders without being very wealthy, because I was just a student, came the realization that we should have asked the European Union to stop international roaming charges, because every single time we were crossing the border, we were paying more when we were receiving a call or making a call. So we asked this in the first European Citizen Initiative, which is one of these tools that the EU created. And this demand reached the attention of the European Commissioner at the time, Neelie Kroes, and that basically transformed itself into a major proposal, as you probably know, in 2015, international roaming charges, not only for calls, but also for data, were abolished in Europe. So it's a little battle that started from a classroom with some students, with some NGOs, that really made a difference for millions and millions of European citizens. Since then, in the framework of my organization, which is called the Good Lobby, every year we assist dozens and dozens of NGOs, grassroots citizens who actually have the same desire. So we help them build good lobbies in order to reach out governments and to actually push for their specific causes. Recently, to give you another example, we realized that there are millions of citizens in Italy who don't have a vote because in order to vote, they need to go home, but many of them live in the north, but they come from the south. So in order to exercise their political rights, they need to travel, and this is very costly. So they're not going to vote. And we managed to build a major campaign around Sanremo, that you certainly know, and those who listen to us know, is this big festival in which many singers decided to basically campaign with us, and they borrow this little pencil and they put their pencil here on the hair, showing that they were supporting this. And as a result, we got a law that exceptionally allowed in the past regional elections that occurred only a few weeks ago to actually having hundreds of thousands of people voting as a result of that adjustment. All these are instances of citizen lobbying that can make a difference at the European level, like in my roaming example, but also at the very national or even local and regional level. So we need to really foster a democratic infrastructure that allow more citizens to feel brave, prepare, do their homework, and allow the political class to deliver and to be held accountable.
My very last question is in relation to Europe of future generations. What is your imagination? How would you imagine European Union in 10 years' time or in 20 years' time? More enlarged, more coherent? What is your imagination?
Being a European at heart, as an Italian who lives in Spain, works in France and in Belgium, and I've been doing this for over 20 years, there's some wishful thinking in believing that the European integration process will remain irreversible, will be opening up and change. At the same time, if you look at the overall appetite of the average European citizens or the appetite of the average European leader, you see that this won't necessarily happen out of deliberate will. It will only happen under pressure if something big happens. And we see a lot of major geopolitical transformations within and outside of Europe, and even those have not been able to push out of their complacencies the average European. But I remain hopeful, not necessarily optimistic and hopeful, and I think that we will inevitably have to rethink entirely the European project. We need to rethink not only how countries who have been waiting for long, like Albania before joining the EU and other Western Balkans country, but also what does it mean for a country to be a member of the European Union? Unless we rethink entirely and question what we have achieved so far, we won't be able to reset and recreate the rules. So obviously, I'm referring to countries like Hungary in this particular moment, which is a country that doesn't seem to deserve to remain in the European Union simply because they are not abiding by the very same obligation they subscribe back in 2005 when they joined the European Union. But then you see countries outside who are actually more, let's say, in line, both in terms of values and in terms of policy delivery than other countries. So there is a problem. And unless we acknowledge that such a problem exists and we need to reset both accession and the meaning of membership of the Union, we are not going to be able to move forward. So there, the big idea, I think, will be to have a concentric Europe, an idea we have been playing with for a long time, especially in academia, but I think should be reconsidered. So to have this big European political community, which has been kind of relaunched as an empty box only a couple of years ago, and within that, to imagine different circles that countries, based on what their citizens, not their leaders, want, might be abiding by. Some might be very much into the internal market, some might be into the internal market and free movement of persons, some they're going to be cherry picking here and there. This is often dismissed as Europe à la carte, sort of Europe we take on the menu of a restaurant, but I think there is value in actually allowing each country to engage and commit to what its citizens believe into, as opposed to being a system in which you either get the full or you get nothing. And this black and white scenario, to me, is no longer tenable in the politics of today. So we really have to be more imaginative, much more pragmatic, and move away from the current approach of, one single format for everybody. That is no longer realistic in present day.
Thank you very much, Alberto. It was a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks for having me. Thank you for the opportunity.